And he used to live in his van, and then he'd come out here and he'd live out here. He built a shed up here.
So do you have a water tank out here and a stove and all of that?
He had a tank, yeah, and he had a. Oh, he used to use firewood for a stove. That's his shed there. He used to put all these signs around saying, like that, "Stop, you've been warned. This place has man traps." In the event of my death by accident or natural causes, this shed and all its contents are left to my mate so-and-so.
So the sound that I wanted to create for this, I wanted very much to recreate the sensation of wind and tide that you experience when you're under the harbor bridge. And so you're hearing this long scroll of rubbing reproducing this sound event. And all of the changes in pitch and placement in stereo are describing that drawing move across these 8 sensors. And so it sounds like a southerly buster or something. So that gives you a little bit of a range of ways that I engage sound. I engage sound in a very direct, hands-on sort of way. And I very much like to make as a key and integral part of any of my process research, really understanding a site, living in a site, if at all possible, for some time before I start to use it as material for my art practice. And as represented in the gallery, Sounding Botany Bay, Sounding Kamay, really is a work that attempts to grapple with the enormous complexity and the many conversations and exchanges of power that take place in Botany Bay. And so in this work, as I was working in terms of process, I tried to, as much as possible, really walk lightly upon the land and really slow down my process so that I could be attentive to change and stimulation and to notice things that I don't normally notice. And that really comes from a kind of Duchampian sense of creating this ready-made object that will destabilize what art can be. So John Cage said that after Duchamp, you couldn't walk into any gallery and not think that the light switch on the wall might be a piece of art. So for me, I really wanted to imagine all of the materials of the bay, all of the processes of the bay, as being a sort of art material, but also as a work that could create a sense of dialogue with the past, with the archive of the past that documented the bay, a kind of current voice of conversation within this gallery, but also in some way to address the future archive. So that as one looks back, one might see that the sandhills are completely and utterly gone, or that certain kinds of species that are represented in the work or voices that are heard in the work have been extinguished. And so in that sense, it's an elegiac work. It's a work of commemoration.
Every time it rains, you can't go and swim because for the next couple of days at least, because of the amount of E. coli and pterococci that's in the environment. Like the sewage system can't handle the water that goes into the sewage system. They don't seem to be able to stop it.
So one of the techniques that I used was the process of the interview. And especially for a university faculty like me, working with human subjects is a very fraught thing. There are all of these kinds of ethical dilemmas that come forward with working with human subjects. And it was very important for me that we have a very strong sense of mutuality and conversation, but that in the resultant interviews that I produced, as I shaped them, that I got out of the way of the subject completely got rid of my questions and allowed the interview subject to speak and to address you directly rather than me. So I'm your surrogate in some sense in this space, but then I need to completely pull myself and my voice out of the process. And so the man that you just heard, Jim Towert, you see here at his oyster depot near Taura. And as I was saying, there's this kind of time marker in all of the images and in the sound. Jim came to the opening the other night, and I was clearly touched by seeing the work, to see his practice as an environmentalist valued, but also I saw in him the loss of his oyster depot. He told me that evening that the depot had been burned down by vandals. And so this place that he had committed 12 years of his life to, very difficult labor, is now gone. And so these images are his only connection to that site right now. And the sound of Jim walking through the land and describing the process of what it meant to be an oysterman before QX caused the oyster population to collapse. You can hear that kind of passion in him, in his voice, and he gives you direct entrance into the process of tarring the trays and setting them out on the punt and all of that. So in some ways, that kind of oral history is an invaluable thing.
464, g'day. Descend 7000, runway 34 left in visual left circuit, and that's when ready.
So that little bit is just there to sort of acknowledge the world of electronic information that's interpenetrating us constantly. There's this radio frequency traffic, digital traffic that's out there all the time, and unless you use the instrumentality of a radio frequency scanner, as I have here, you don't hear that inaudible electronic world of information that's pulsing through every one of us right now. So this allowed me to listen to, say, the broadcast of the airport and capture that as one of the materials of the bay that were invisible and inaudible. Another is using the hydrophone to listen to that underwater world. So that's snails having brekkie. And that rasping crunch is going on constantly. And the only way we become aware of it is to dip that extended ear into the water and to listen to their constant activity, their constant kind of percolating, popping sounds of prawns and oysters and these rasping little shells that are constantly doing the work of the ecology in the bay. I use a number of instruments that I have scored and arranged and recorded in my studio to make a sort of emotional undergirding for the bay. And I was trying to really find very long tones that would produce a sense of the magical or the haunted or the natural, like the sound of whale calls, for instance. And so this is an instrument called the waterphone, which is filled with just a touch of water in this basin, and it's bowed or it's hit with a mallet. And as you move it, it produces these kind of shimmering effects. And I wanted to create that tie between the water voice of this instrument and the water voice of the bay. And I wanted to produce, again, that kind of sensation that Uncle Max alluded to, in which everything in the bay is alive and in communication. And you need to be attentive to it. You need to be aware that it's informing you in some sense. And so this is a movement from the work that introduces the score. That's the waterphone. And in this piece, I really wanted to hint at a kind of primordial creation story of the bay, that it would start in deluge, and then this movement of the human stewards of the bay and moving through this kind of repatriation of remains would in some way suture the past to the present, create a montage between that past space of creation of the bay itself as an ecosystem to the human stewardship of the bay in the long period of indigenous stewardship to the modern. And so you start to hear aircraft ease in and then air traffic control. So it was my way of doing the jump cut that you see in 2001 when the bone is tossed into the air and it turns into that orbiting space station. It's a way of suturing these spaces together very quickly. In this work, you'll see that we've got all of these speakers around us to produce that sense of immersion. And usually, again, to allude to this kind of film notion of sound, especially surround sound, most dialogue happens in the center because that's where we're focused. We're focused on the image. Here, I really wanted to move the viewer around with sound. So you'll hear aircraft transit the space. You'll hear birds move through the space. You'll hear people move through the space. And one thing that I'm trying to create is a sense of movement among the prints. These are called movement quite literally because I think of this as a musical composition, whether it has the visual kind of scope of the image or the sound scope of the image. I think in terms of leitmotif, in opera, so that there are certain kinds of themes that recur both in the dialogue of the interviews, but also in the images that you see, certain kinds of remarkable stresses or powers that I saw in the bay. There are certain kinds of musical marks of cadence here. The reason I repeat the Cook Monument is I'm creating a kind of cadence. I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, quite literally, and also describing the many ways the monument is used as sort of a prop for photographs, as this kind of didactic site to say, it happened here, to see the kind of golden cast of light of nostalgia, and then to have this juxtaposition and the renewed kind of interpretation of the park with a very strong Aboriginal voice and presence, that you'd have this kind of juxtaposition. So I was always very mindful of the way that I needed to note the space visually and the way that I needed to note the space sonically. And in my process, I think I allude to this in my catalog essay, sometimes my images were led by the sound, and so I would hear something and swing around and get my point and shoot camera and take a snap. And that at other times, the camera led me to a sound. And so it was almost as though I was being conducted through the themes that would eventually emerge. The other thing that was very important to me, I think I talked about this kind of walking gently or slowing down. It was really essential because I've done projects in the American West in the past, and most Americans have an experience of the American West at 110 kilometers, just zooming through the Utah Badlands or seeing the Red Rock Desert, these glorious spaces framed by the window of a car, framed by the window of an aircraft or by a train. And one thing that I wanted to do is, as Uncle Max suggested, to notice all of these kinds of vibrations between things by just walking the space and by moving through it at a very slow pace, and also to return to it so that I could see things like the for sale sign, these properties around the Captain Cook Drive moving in 1 year from 30% sold to 50% sold. To look at the way that the dunes have been carted away and then are being incrementally filled with the building rubbish of Sydney. And so there's this value that's extracted and then this value that's added, and there's a kind of poverty in the value that's added when you put rubbish back into the site that had been filled with a millennia worth of dunes. And so I was constantly trying to find these markers of deep time, present time, and some kind of predictive time for what could happen in the future in these movements.